I'm 52 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I was doing everything right. I married young, not because I was deeply in love in some wild, consuming way, but because it felt like the natural next step. Everyone around me was doing it, settling down, building something stable. I thought love was supposed to feel calm, predictable, safe. And in many ways it was. There were no dramatic fights, no passionate reconciliations, no sweeping gestures. Just routine, quiet mornings, shared responsibilities, a life built on consistency rather than excitement. We had 2 children. They became the center of my world almost instantly. I poured myself into raising them, making sure they had everything they needed. Everything I thought I hadn't fully understood when I was younger. I kept the house tidy, made dinners on time, attended school events, remembered birthdays, and smoothed over every small crack that appeared in our family life. People used to describe me as steady, reliable, calm. I wore those words like a badge of honor. But somewhere along the way, without realizing it, I stopped being a person and became a role. A caretaker, a problem solver, a woman who made sure everything ran smoothly, even if it meant quietly setting aside parts of herself. Love, for me, became something you maintain, not something you feel. And I convinced myself that was enough. After the divorce, things didn't fall apart the way people expect them to. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches. It was quiet, almost too quiet. We both agreed it was time. The love we had once relied on had faded into something polite and distant. We parted like 2 people who had simply reached the end of a long conversation. The kids were grown by then, already stepping into their own lives. They handled it better than I expected, maybe because they had seen it coming long before we admitted it out loud. And just like that, I was alone. At first, I filled my days with structure. Mornings started early, coffee on the porch, a quick walk through the garden. I kept the house just as neat as it had always been, even though there was no one left to notice. I told myself I liked it that way, that I preferred the quiet. I became good at being alone. Too good, maybe. I didn't date. Not really. I told myself I wasn't interested, that I had already experienced everything there was to experience when it came to love. What would be the point of starting over at this age? Learning someone new, adjusting, risking disappointment again? No, it was easier to stay where I was. Safe, predictable, uncomplicated. And for a long time, I truly believed that meant I was happy. But looking back now, I can see the difference. I wasn't happy. I was comfortable. There's a difference people don't talk about enough. Comfort doesn't ask anything of you. It doesn't challenge you, doesn't push you, doesn't wake you up in the middle of the night with a racing heart or fill your chest with something you can't quite explain. Comfort is quiet. It's steady. It's numb in a way. Happiness, real happiness, has edges. It makes you feel alive, even when it scares you. I didn't know that then. I thought I did. I thought I had everything figured out. That's why what happened next caught me completely off guard. It started on a Friday afternoon in early June. The kind of afternoon where the air feels thick and heavy, like it's carrying something you can't quite see. The sun was high, pressing down on everything, and the garden smelled like warm earth and freshly watered soil. I had just finished watering the plants when my phone buzzed in my hand. I wiped my forehead with the back of my arm and glanced down at the screen. It was Rachel, my closest friend since college. We had been through everything together. Late-night study sessions, heartbreaks, marriages, children, divorces. She was one of the few people who knew me before I became this version of myself. Her message was simple. Would it be okay if Ethan stayed with you this weekend? My dad's in the hospital, and I need to drive down to Tallahassee. I blinked at the screen, reading it twice. Ethan, her son, 17, almost 18. I hadn't seen him in a while, not properly. In my mind, he was still the quiet little boy who used to cling to her leg whenever they visited. The one who barely spoke above a whisper and avoided eye contact like it was something dangerous. But time doesn't wait for anyone. Kids grow up, whether you're paying attention or not. I hesitated for only a moment before replying. Of course. Don't worry about anything. Just focus on your dad. She responded almost immediately, thanking me more times than necessary. That was Rachel. Always grateful, always a little overwhelmed by life, even when she handled it better than most. I slipped my phone into my pocket and stood there for a moment longer, looking out over the yard. I didn't think much of it then. To me, it was just a favor, a simple temporary disruption to my otherwise quiet routine. I had no idea it would become anything more than that. He arrived a few hours later. I heard the car pull into the driveway and stepped out onto the porch, drying my hands on a kitchen towel. When I saw him step out of the passenger seat, I felt a brief flicker of surprise. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was tall, taller than I remembered. His shoulders had broadened, his posture more confident. Even if there was still a hint of hesitation in the way he moved, his hair was a little longer, falling slightly into his eyes, and when he looked up at me, there was something different in his expression. Something older, more aware. He grabbed a worn duffel bag from the back seat and walked toward me, offering a polite smile. "Thanks for letting me stay, Miss Garrett." His voice had changed too, deeper, steadier. I smiled back, waving off the formality. "Oh, please. You're not 12 anymore. Call me Diane." He hesitated for a second, then nodded. "Okay, Diane." There was a small smile there, almost shy, but not quite. And for just a moment, his gaze lingered on my face a little longer than I expected. I told myself I imagined it, that I was reading into something that wasn't there. After all, he was just a kid. We settled into an easy rhythm that evening. I made spaghetti for dinner. Rachel had mentioned once that it was his favorite, and he seemed genuinely pleased by it. He thanked me more than once, which I found oddly endearing. After dinner, we sat in the living room and watched a movie. Some action film he picked. I didn't follow the plot much. My attention drifted in and out, but he was completely absorbed, leaning forward slightly, eyes fixed on the screen like he was searching for something deeper than just entertainment. It struck me then how different he was from what I expected. He wasn't glued to his phone. He wasn't distant or disinterested. He was present. We didn't talk much that night, just small things. School, his plans after graduation. He admitted he wasn't sure what he wanted yet. Maybe trade school, maybe working with his uncle out in Colorado. There was a quiet honesty in the way he spoke. No pretending, no forced confidence, just openness. Later, before heading to bed, I grabbed a set of folded towels for him. I found him out on the back deck, sitting alone, staring into the dark. The yard was alive with the soft flicker of fireflies, blinking on and off like distant signals. The air hummed with the sound of cicadas, steady and almost hypnotic. "You okay?" I asked gently, stepping outside. He nodded but didn't answer right away. Then after a moment he spoke. "Sometimes I wish I could just stop time. Just freeze it." I paused, studying him. "You ever feel that way?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't expected something like that. I looked at him more closely then. At the curve of his jaw, the seriousness in his eyes, the way the dim light softened his features. "Yeah," I said quietly, "more than you'd think." He turned his head and looked at me, really looked, and in that moment something shifted. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there, a quiet understanding, unspoken. He smiled after a second, as if brushing the moment aside, and stood up. "Good night." "Good night," I replied. I watched him walk back inside, and then I stayed there, alone on the deck, long after he was gone, trying to make sense of the strange warmth spreading through my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just nostalgia, just the comfort of company, just the reminder of a different time in my life. It wasn't attraction. It couldn't be. So I didn't let myself think about it any further. I went inside, turned off the lights, and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easily that night. And somewhere deep down, in a place I hadn't paid attention to in years, something had already begun to change. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. For a moment, I didn't remember why. The house was still, wrapped in that soft quiet that comes just before sunrise. Pale light filtered through the curtains, painting faint patterns across the walls. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. And then it came back to me. Ethan was here. A small, almost unnoticeable shift happened in my chest at the thought. I sat up slowly, brushing my hair back, trying to ignore the strange awareness settling into my body. It felt ridiculous. I had hosted guests before. Friends, family, even acquaintances passing through town. There was nothing unusual about sharing my space for a few days. So why did this feel different? I pushed the thought away and got out of bed. The routine helped. It always did. Coffee first, then the porch, then a quiet moment to gather myself before the day properly began. By the time the coffee was ready, the sky had softened into shades of gold and pale blue. I stepped outside, wrapping my hands around the warm mug, letting the heat ground me. Everything felt normal, or at least it looked normal. But underneath that calm surface, something was unsettled. I told myself it would pass. that whatever I felt last night was just a fleeting moment, a trick of memory, loneliness, and the unfamiliar presence of someone new in my quiet world. Nothing more. I had almost convinced myself of that when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, bare, familiar already. I didn't turn right away. I knew it was him. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. I turned then, offering a small smile. "Morning." He looked different in the daylight. Less shadowed, more real. His hair was slightly messy, his t-shirt wrinkled, his eyes still carrying that softness of someone not fully awake yet. And yet, there was something steady about him too. "You're up early," he said. "Habit," I replied lightly. "Want some breakfast?" He nodded, stretching slightly before following me inside. The kitchen felt smaller with him in it. Not physically, just different. I moved through my usual motions, cracking eggs, heating the pan, reaching for plates, but I was aware of him in a way that made me slightly uneasy. He didn't speak much. He just sat there watching. Not in an uncomfortable way, just observing. And somehow, that made me more self-conscious than if he had been talking non-stop. "You always seem so calm," he said after a while. I glanced at him, raising an eyebrow slightly. "Is that your way of saying I'm boring?" He shook his head quickly. "No, not at all." There was a pause before he added, quieter this time, "I just mean, it's nice. You make things feel safe." The word settled into me in a way I didn't expect. Safe. I had spent years being that for everyone else. A steady presence, a place people could rely on. But hearing it like that, simple, honest, unfiltered, it did something to me. "Thank you," I said softly. He just nodded and went back to eating, as if he hadn't said anything particularly meaningful. But I felt it, more than I should have. After breakfast, the day unfolded easily. Too easily. He offered to help with things without being asked, cleaning out a few boxes in the garage, carrying things I could have managed on my own, moving through the space like he belonged there, but without overstepping. We played music while we worked, old songs, Fleetwood Mac mostly. I teased him about it. "Your taste is better than I expected." He laughed, a real, unguarded laugh. "That's because my mom raised me right. She listens to your playlists, you know." I smiled at that, shaking my head. I didn't know I had an influence like that. "You do," he said simply. And again, there it was. That feeling, being seen, not as someone's ex-wife, not as someone's mother, not as a woman who had settled into the background of her own life, but as me. By late afternoon, the heat had settled heavily over everything. The kind that makes the air feel thick and slow. "We should cool off," I said, more to myself than him. "Pool?" He looked up, a hint of a smile forming. "Yeah, that sounds good." It had been years since I'd used the pool. I changed into a one-piece I hadn't worn in ages, suddenly aware of how it fit, how my body had changed, how time had left its marks. For a moment I considered changing back, choosing something safer. But I didn't. I stepped outside. He was already in the water, floating lazily, eyes closed, completely at ease. There was something about that image that made me pause. He looked peaceful, unburdened in a way I couldn't remember feeling. "Come on in," he said without opening his eyes. I slipped into the water slowly. It was warm, almost the same temperature as the air, wrapping around me in a way that felt both comforting and unfamiliar. We talked about nothing, small things, light things, and yet there was an undercurrent there, something unspoken. Then he looked at me, directly. "You don't smile much," he said. I blinked, caught off guard. "I do." He shook his head slightly. "You pretend to, but when it's real, it's different." My breath caught. I laughed it off, instinctively deflecting. "You're very observant." He didn't respond to that. He just held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and then looked away. But the words stayed with me, the way he said them, the certainty in his voice. That night I couldn't sleep. Again, I lay there staring into the dark, replaying moments I didn't fully understand. The way he looked at me, the things he said, the way I felt in response. It didn't make sense. It wasn't supposed to make sense, and yet it did, in a way that unsettled me even more. The next day began quietly, but something had shifted. I could feel it, in the air, in the space between us, in the way silence no longer felt neutral. By afternoon, the sky had turned gray. Clouds rolled in slowly, heavy with rain. A storm was coming. We ended up in the living room, the light dim, the sound of rain tapping steadily against the windows. I lit a few candles, more out of habit than necessity. We sat on opposite ends of the couch at first. An old photo album rested between us. I hadn't opened it in years. "That's my daughter," I said, pointing to a picture of a small girl in muddy boots, holding a frog with absolute pride. "She looks like you," he said. "Same eyes." I smiled faintly. "She's stronger than I ever was." He turned toward me then. "You don't give yourself enough credit." The room felt smaller suddenly, quieter. The distance between us didn't feel as wide as it had a moment ago. "You remind me of someone I used to know," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He tilted his head slightly. "Is that a good thing?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, but it also scares me." The honesty of that moment lingered, heavy, unavoidable. Then, gently, without hesitation, he reached out and touched my hand, just resting his fingers lightly over mine. Nothing more, but it was enough. Everything in me tensed, not from discomfort, from awareness, from the undeniable reality of what that small gesture meant. "You don't have to be afraid with me," he said quietly. And for a moment, I believed him. I didn't pull away immediately. I let it sit there. That connection, that warmth, that dangerous, fragile line we were both pretending not to see. But eventually I stood, not because I wanted to, because I had to. "I'm going to make some tea," I said, my voice not as steady as I would have liked. He didn't stop me, didn't question it. He just watched me walk away. In the kitchen, I gripped the counter, my heart racing. This had to stop. It had to. I told myself that over and over again. This wasn't real. This wasn't something I could allow to grow. It was just a moment, a strange, confusing overlap of loneliness and connection. Nothing more. But even as I stood there, trying to steady myself, I could still feel the warmth of his hand on mine. And deep down, I knew the truth. Something had already begun, and pretending not to see it wouldn't make it disappear. The rain had stopped by morning, but the world didn't feel the same. There's a certain kind of quiet that follows a storm, not the peaceful kind. Something heavier, like everything is holding its breath, waiting to see what remains after the noise has passed. That's what the house felt like. I stood barefoot on the porch, my coffee cooling in my hands, watching the mist lift slowly from the yard. The grass still glistened, every surface touched by the storm, changed in small ways that only became noticeable if you looked closely enough. I felt like that too. Not entirely different, but not the same either. Ethan hadn't come downstairs yet, and I wasn't sure how to feel about that. Part of me was relieved, grateful for the extra time to gather my thoughts, to rebuild the walls I knew needed to be there, and another part of me missed him. The realization unsettled me more than anything else. I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself, but it didn't help much. My thoughts kept circling back to the same moments. His voice, his eyes, the way his hand had rested over mine like it belonged there. It didn't. I knew that. I repeated it to myself like a quiet mantra. It doesn't belong there. It can't. I heard the footsteps before I saw him. That same familiar rhythm I had already memorized without meaning to. He stepped onto the porch beside me, stretching slightly, his t-shirt still wrinkled from sleep. There was something softer about him this morning. Or maybe it was just the light. "Morning," he said. "Hey." We stood there in silence for a while. The birds had returned, filling the air with sound like nothing unusual had happened. Like the storm hadn't passed through at all. "You okay?" he asked eventually. I hesitated. The truth hovered at the edge of my lips, uncomfortable and unpolished. "I'm not sure," I admitted. He nodded slowly, like he understood more than I had actually said. "Yesterday," he began, then paused. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," I replied too quickly. Then I exhaled, softer this time. "Not exactly." He waited. He didn't rush me, didn't fill the silence. Just stood there, present, and somehow that made it harder to hide. I started, then stopped, searching for the right words. "I think I forgot what it feels like to be noticed." "Really noticed." My grip tightened slightly around the mug. "And I wasn't expecting it from you." There it was. Honest, uncomfortable, real. "I wasn't expecting it either," he said quietly. That should have made things easier. It didn't. If anything, it made everything more complicated. We didn't say much after that. There wasn't anything left to say that wouldn't push things further than they already were. So we did what people do when they don't know how to face something. We avoided it. We spent the rest of the morning doing ordinary things. Grocery shopping, folding laundry, moving through familiar routines. like they could somehow anchor us back to something safe. But the normalcy felt thin, fragile. Every glance lingered just a second too long. Every accidental brush of the hand carried more weight than it should have. It was there, constant, unspoken. By afternoon, we found ourselves back in the living room. A quiet film played on the screen, something slow and thoughtful that neither of us was fully paying attention to. I sat on one end of the couch. He sat on the other. At least that's how it started. Somewhere along the way, the space between us seemed to disappear. Not physically, but emotionally. And then, without a word, he reached out. His hand found mine again. This time I didn't pull away. I didn't even hesitate. I just let it happen. The movie flickered across the screen, light dancing over our faces. But I wasn't watching it anymore. I was aware of his hand, the warmth, the steady rhythm of his pulse beneath my fingers, and my own hand, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. When the credits rolled, neither of us moved right away. He turned toward me slowly. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. I nodded. "You're the first person in a long time who's really listened to me," he said. "Who hasn't made me feel like I'm just a kid." My chest tightened. "You're not just a kid," I said softly. "I know," he replied. "But you're the only one who makes me feel like that." There was something in his voice, something raw, something honest, and it reached into parts of me I had spent years ignoring. Before I could think better of it, I lifted my hand, brushing a strand of hair away from his forehead. The gesture was instinctive, gentle, familiar in a way that didn't make sense. He leaned forward slightly, not enough to close the distance, just enough to make me aware of how close we already were. And that's when something inside me snapped back into place. I stood up abruptly. "I need to start dinner," I said, my voice unsteady. He didn't stop me, didn't question it. He just watched me walk away. In the kitchen, I gripped the edge of the counter, my breathing uneven. This wasn't just a moment anymore. This was something real, and that made it dangerous. Because real things don't disappear easily. That night, dinner passed quietly. Not awkward, not tense, just careful, like we were both aware of something fragile between us, and neither of us wanted to be the one to break it. Afterward, he insisted on helping with the dishes. We stood side by side, moving in a slow, deliberate rhythm. He washed, I dried. Our hands brushed once, then again. Neither of us acknowledged it, but neither of us pulled away too quickly either. When we finished, he turned to me. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For this. For being you." The words settled into me in a way I couldn't fully process. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. Instead, I reached up and touched his cheek. Just once. Light. Careful. And in that moment, something became clear to me. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't even about attraction, not in the way people usually define it. This was about connection, about being seen, about feeling something real after years of living in quiet routine. And that's what made it so hard to walk away from. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in the living room, the lights dim, the house wrapped in that same heavy stillness from the morning. I replayed everything, every word, every glance, every moment where I could have chosen differently. But I hadn't, because some part of me hadn't wanted to. It was sometime after 2 a.m. when I heard footsteps on the stairs. I didn't turn around. I knew it was him. "I couldn't sleep," he said softly. Neither could I. He sat down beside me, leaving just enough space to keep things safe, or at least to pretend they were. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said after a while. "I know." The words felt heavier than they should have. "I don't want this to be something we pretend didn't happen." I turned to look at him. "We haven't done anything," I said. He held my gaze. "We have." And he was right. Even without crossing any clear lines, something had happened. Something real. "Even if we haven't, you feel it too, don't you?" he asked. I looked away. But silence is sometimes the loudest answer. "I do," I admitted quietly. "But that doesn't mean we should." "I'm not asking for forever," he said. "I just don't want to feel like I imagined it." "You didn't." The room fell quiet again. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, a soft, restless sound. And then slowly he reached for my hand. This time I didn't hesitate. I let it happen. Not because it was right, but because it was honest. We sat there in silence. No expectations, no promises, just presence. After a while, I leaned my head against his shoulder. It felt natural, easy, like something I had known before but forgotten. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't try to define it. I just let myself feel it. Because sometimes a moment doesn't need a future to be real. Morning came too quickly. The kind of morning that doesn't ask if you're ready, it just arrives. He packed his bag quietly. We moved around each other like we always had. Polite, familiar, careful. When it was time for him to leave, we stood by the door. Neither of us quite sure what to say. Take care of yourself, I said finally. You too. There was a pause. A moment where something more could have happened. But it didn't. And maybe that was the right thing. Or maybe it was just the easier thing. He stepped outside, the door closing softly behind him. And just like that, he was gone. The house felt different immediately. Quieter, emptier. But not the same kind of empty it had been before. This time it wasn't numb. It was aware. Alive in a way that hurt a little. I stood there for a long time after he left. Thinking, feeling, understanding something I hadn't before. I had spent years choosing safety, choosing comfort, convincing myself it was the same as happiness. But now I knew the truth. It wasn't. And maybe what happened that weekend wasn't something I could carry forward. Maybe it wasn't meant to be anything more than a moment. But it changed something in me. It reminded me that I was still capable of feeling, still capable of being seen, still capable of wanting more than just a quiet, predictable life. And that realization was something I couldn't ignore anymore.